What if I told you some rock legends smoked over 100 cigarettes a day, turning chain smoking into an extreme sport? From Elvis Presley's iconic stage presence to Keith Richards' rebellious rock and roll lifestyle. Here are 25 biggest chain smokers in rock and roll history. 1. Elvis Presley. Known as the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley was famous for his powerful stage presence and rebellious attitude, and smoking was a big part of that image. A cigarette was almost always in his hand, whether he was on stage, in the studio, or out in public. It wasn't just a habit, it became a symbol of who he was. For Elvis, smoking was a way to handle the pressure of fame. As he became more popular, his smoking increased. The cigarettes helped him through late-night recording sessions, and each puff seemed to go along with creating another hit. Smoking wasn't just something he did, it was a part of the image millions of fans loved. However, smoking had its consequences. Over the years, it took a toll on his health. By the 1970s, Elvis's health was rapidly declining, and smoking played a big part in that. Even as his health worsened, the cigarette was still part of his life, a comfort but also a harmful habit. His smoking became just as famous as his music, and he remains one of rock and roll's most well-known smokers. 2. John Lennon. The bold leader of the Beatles, John Lennon was known for his strong political views and rebellious spirit. He wasn't just a musician, he was a symbol of change. Like Elvis, Lennon was rarely seen without a cigarette in his hand. Smoking was part of his defiance against society. In interviews, on stage, or just in everyday life, Lennon often had a cigarette. Smoking wasn't just something he did for fun, it helped him think. His cigarette breaks were where some of his best ideas and lyrics came to him. But smoking took a toll on Lennon too. As he grew older, his health began to suffer, and the sharp mind he was known for started to weaken. Despite his later efforts to promote peace and healthy living, his image as a heavy smoker stuck with him. Smoking had been both his partner and enemy throughout his life, shaping the artist he became. 3. Paul McCartney. One of the biggest changes in rock music history is Paul McCartney's story. Today, he is known for living a healthy lifestyle. But when he was younger, things were different. He smoked a lot. During his time with the Beatles, you could often see him with a cigarette, whether he was performing, practicing, or just walking around. For McCartney, smoking wasn't a way to rebel like it was for John Lennon. It was his way of handling the stress of being in one of the most famous bands in the world. The long tours, constant interviews, and all the attention from the media made him feel like smoking was a way to escape. Over time, McCartney started to realize the health risks of smoking. By the 1980s, he decided to quit and focus on living a healthier life. This change became a big part of his image later on. However, his smoking years are still a big part of his story. His cigarettes were almost as famous as his music. 4. Freddie Mercury. One of a kind, Freddie Mercury's voice was powerful enough to move anyone who heard it. But behind that amazing voice, he was a heavy smoker. He started smoking when he was a teenager, and by the time he was the lead singer of Queen, cigarettes were always with him. Whether he was performing at Live Aid or recording in the studio, Freddie had a cigarette in his hand. What made his smoking stand out was the contrast. He had a voice that could break glass, yet he smoked. A surprising habit for someone whose instrument was his voice. Despite this, Freddie's voice stayed strong for most of his career, almost like his smoking and singing went hand in hand. His smoking wasn't just about the habit. It was part of the wild rock and roll lifestyle he lived. But by the 1990s, his health started to decline. His once clear voice began to sound weaker, and his bandmates were worried. Even though his health was getting worse, Freddie still smoked. It's tragic that one of rock's greatest voices was damaged by smoking. But just like his voice, his smoking became a part of who he was, and it's still remembered as part of his story. 5. Jimi Hendrix. Known for his groundbreaking guitar skills, Jimi Hendrix was never seen without a cigarette in his hand. Whether he was on stage at Woodstock or playing in the studio, he always had a cigarette lit. The smoke around him added to the vibe of his music, making it feel wild and free. His fans couldn't imagine him without it. The cigarette was a part of his rock star image, rebellious, carefree, and breaking all the rules. But the cigarette wasn't just part of his public persona. It also played a role in his struggles. Personal battles, including substance use, took a toll on Hendrix, and his smoking habits contributed to his downfall. At just 27 years old, he passed away. The cigarette that once symbolized rebellion was now a reminder of the dangerous side of his lifestyle. 6. Kurt Cobain. The lead singer of Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, was also famous for his cigarette smoking. Like Hendrix, Cobain's cigarette was more than just a habit. It was part of his rebellious image. His music was raw, and his personal life was filled with pain and struggles. Smoking was a way for him to cope with the pressure of fame and his inner battles. Cobain was often seen smoking while performing, and his messy appearance only added to the image of a tortured artist. His cigarette was a symbol of his struggle with depression and fame. The more famous he became, the more he smoked, and the more his internal struggles seemed to intensify. In the end, his addiction to smoking, combined with other struggles, led to his tragic death at 27. 7. Mick Jagger. Famous for his high-energy performances as the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger built an image around wild dancing, a strong voice, and a constant cigarette. He smoked everywhere, during interviews, between songs, and even on stage. Smoking was so closely tied to his rock star persona that it was hard to imagine him without it. Jagger's smoking matched his larger-than-life persona. Whether on stage or backstage, the cigarette was always with him. It seemed to give him the energy needed for his wild performances. But over time, smoking started to affect him. His voice, once clear and strong, became more raspy. Even though it changed his voice, he never stopped smoking. He stayed true to his rock and roll lifestyle. 8. Bob Dylan. The famous singer and songwriter from the 1960s, Bob Dylan was always seen with a cigarette. His raspy voice became one of his trademarks, and many people think smoking helped give him that unique sound. To Dylan, smoking wasn't just a habit. It was part of his creative process and a sign of rebellion. Dylan's cigarette showed his free spirit and refusal to follow the rules. In the 1960s, his image as a wandering artist wouldn't have been complete without it. It was a reflection of the times, full of change and defiance. As time passed, his smoking didn't slow down. Dylan's voice, rough and raw like his music, was closely linked to his constant smoking. Even as the world changed around him, his cigarette remained a symbol of his free, bohemian lifestyle. 9. David Bowie. Always changing his look and music, David Bowie had one constant: his cigarette. Whether he was Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, or a pop star in the 80s, a cigarette was always with him. It wasn't just an addiction, it was part of his image. In the early 70s, during his glam rock days, the cigarette was part of his bold style. Ziggy's bright clothes and alien look wouldn't have been the same without it. The cigarette added danger and mystery to his character. As Bowie shifted to his Thin White Duke persona, the cigarette stayed. This time, it matched his cold, detached attitude and the darker, self-destructive themes in his music. Even as he got older, he kept smoking, despite its toll on his health. The cigarette became part of who he was, just like his music. By the time he quit smoking, Bowie was already a rock legend. His cigarette had been a constant part of his transformation, telling a story of rebellion, creativity, and change. 10. Jim Morrison. The lead singer of The Doors, Jim Morrison, was known for his rebellious spirit. Like Bowie, his cigarette became a symbol of his persona. As the Lizard King, he was often seen with a cigarette in his mouth. For Morrison, smoking was more than a habit. It reflected his inner struggles and his attraction to self-destruction. On stage, his cigarette wasn't just for show, it was part of the intense energy of his performances. Whether singing or thinking backstage, the cigarette added to his dark, brooding image. Morrison's cigarette became part of the myth of his tragic life. His wild behavior and early death at 27 made it a symbol of his reckless, self-destructive lifestyle. It showed his struggle with fame and the choices that led to his early death. Even after he was gone, the image of Morrison with a cigarette lived on. It became part of rock and roll history, capturing how the lifestyle could consume those who embraced it fully. The sight of him smoking while singing about freedom, death, and love will never be forgotten. 11. Keith Richards. The famous guitarist of the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards, is known as much for his cigarette habit as for his music. Smoking was part of his rock and roll image. He didn't just smoke for the addiction, it was a symbol of his defiance against the norms of society. Even through rock and roll's wild years, a cigarette was always with him. Smoking wasn't just something he did, it was part of his identity. Every drag he took showed his rebellious attitude. Whether on stage, in interviews, or just living his life, Richards was always seen with a cigarette. It was a part of who he was, just like his famous riffs. Richards wasn't afraid of the consequences. His smoking became part of the rock and roll lifestyle. Live fast, live hard, and never apologize. Even though his health suffered over time, he refused to stop smoking. His image as a rock star who survived everything only grew stronger, with the cigarette still part of his story. 12. Slash. It's hard not to picture Slash with a cigarette hanging from his lips. As the guitarist for Guns N' Roses, he became the face of rock and roll in the late 80s and early 90s. His top hat, curly hair, and cigarette became symbols of rebellion. Slash wasn't just playing music, he was living it. He often had a cigarette in his mouth while shredding on his guitar. The smoke that followed him seemed to add to his cool, laid-back style. The cigarette wasn't just an accessory, it was part of his wild energy, matching the chaos of Guns N' Roses. Over time, smoking began to take its toll on his health, and he eventually cut back. But even after quitting, the image of Slash with a cigarette remained in the minds of fans. He's still remembered as one of rock's biggest smokers, a symbol of everything raw and real about his time in the music world. 13. Ozzy Osbourne. One of the most famous names in heavy metal, Ozzy Osbourne became known for his wild performances, powerful music, and chaotic lifestyle as the lead singer of Black Sabbath. But just as famous as his music was his cigarette, he was almost never seen without one. From the start of Black Sabbath's success, his cigarette was more than just a habit. It was part of his image. The Prince of Darkness didn't just sing about living dangerously, he lived that way too. On stage and off, his cigarette was always there, making him look even more rebellious, like someone who followed no rules but his own. Smoking was just one of Ozzy's many dangerous habits. He drank too much, used substances, and smoked all the time. His cigarette was part of the bigger picture, his life of excess. Even when doctors warned him about his health, he kept smoking. It wasn't just an addiction, it was part of who he was. Even after he quit, people still picture him with a cigarette in hand. That image of Ozzy, the wild rocker with a cigarette and a devil-may-care attitude, remains a lasting part of his legend. 14. Eric Clapton. One of the best guitar players in the world, Eric Clapton is known for his emotional music and legendary guitar skills. But another thing that was always with him was his cigarette. No matter where he went, he had one in hand. Clapton was often seen playing his guitar with a cigarette between his lips. Whether in a band like Cream or performing solo, his image was tied to that steady puff of smoke. For him, smoking wasn't just something to do, it matched his bluesy, raw style. It became a part of his persona. Struggling with addiction to alcohol and other substances, Clapton fought many battles. But even after overcoming those, smoking was the hardest habit to quit. No matter how much it hurt his health, he kept lighting up. The cigarette became a symbol of both his struggles and his deep emotional music. As he got older, smoking started to take a serious toll. Years of smoking led to lung disease, but even then, quitting wasn't easy. His image, guitar in one hand, cigarette in the other, was burned into rock history. Alongside his music, his chain-smoking lifestyle remains part of his legacy. 15. Axl Rose. Guns N' Roses had a leader who didn't just perform, he changed rock and roll. Axl Rose, with his wild energy and powerful voice, made a huge impact in the late 1980s and early 1990s. What really set him apart wasn't just his music or stage presence, but how he refused to follow the usual rock star rules. Most rock stars were clean, calm, and controlled. He was the opposite, wild, unpredictable, and unapologetic. And nothing showed that side of him more than his cigarette. From the start, the cigarette became part of who he was. It wasn't just something he smoked, it was his way of saying, "I don't care about the clean rock star image." With every concert, every interview, and every bold move, Axl dared people to challenge him. He wasn't just there to entertain, he was there to break the rules. That cigarette wasn't just a habit, it was a symbol of rebellion. When Guns N' Roses performed in massive arenas, he would stand with a cigarette hanging from his lips. The smoke swirled around him, adding to the wild energy of the show. It wasn't just something he smoked. It was part of the whole experience, a symbol of the chaos that made Guns N' Roses unforgettable. The cigarette became an image that spoke louder than words ever could. Even as the band slowed down, his rebellious image never disappeared. In interviews, during quiet moments, and even when the band reunited, he was even seen with a cigarette in hand. 16. Steven Tyler. Aerosmith had a frontman who didn't just sing, he became the face of rock and roll. Steven Tyler, with his powerful voice and wild stage presence, wasn't just known for his music or crazy moves. His cigarette was just as famous. Like his long hair and scarves, it was part of his image. It wasn't just a prop, it symbolized everything he stood for: living loud, living fast, and never following the rules. Tyler's stage presence was electric. With every note he sang, every scream, and every crazy move, he pushed the limits of rock and roll. And in the middle of it all, there was the cigarette. Sometimes hanging from his lips, sometimes between his fingers, it was as much a part of the show as the music itself. Smoking wasn't just a habit, it was a statement, a way of saying, "I do what I want, and nothing can stop me." Off stage, the cigarette was just as important. Tyler lived every day like an adventure, pushing limits without caring about the consequences. Even when health warnings grew louder, he didn't stop. Smoking wasn't just about addiction, it was about holding on to the rock and roll spirit. The cigarette became part of his identity, an image burned into rock history. His refusal to quit wasn't just about nicotine, it was about keeping the past alive. Even as time went on and his health became a concern, the cigarette was a reminder of the energy he brought to the stage. It wasn't just for show, it was part of his commitment to the rock star lifestyle. For Tyler, smoking was more than a habit. It was a sign of rebellion, freedom, and living life without rules. His legacy would always be tied to the image of him with a cigarette in hand, singing his heart out. 17. Frank Sinatra. Smoothness and style defined Frank Sinatra's world, a sharp contrast to the loud, wild energy of rock and roll. Known as the chairman of the board, he wasn't just a singer, he was a symbol of class. His voice was warm and smooth, like velvet, and his presence was sharp and confident, just like the suits he wore. Among the many things that made him stand out was his love for cigars. While rock stars smoked to show rebellion, Sinatra's cigars were a statement of confidence and control. His smoking wasn't rushed. It was slow and deliberate, just like everything else in his life. The cigars weren't just a habit. They were a symbol of his calm power. On stage, the cigars added to his commanding presence. He controlled the crowd with ease, and the smoke from his cigar became part of that control. Even in interviews, he was often seen with one in hand. While rock stars smoked to embrace chaos, Sinatra's smoking reinforced his authority. He didn't just follow the music world, he defined it. 18. Johnny Cash. The Man in Black wasn't just a country singer. He was a symbol of rebellion, strength, and sorrow. His deep voice carried the weight of many struggles, but what made his performances unforgettable wasn't just his voice. It was the cigarette he always had. Cash didn't just smoke to pass the time. His cigarette was always with him, burning in the air. Whether on stage or in the studio, he was rarely seen without it. The smoke seemed to be a part of his music, blending with each song. His smoking wasn't just a habit. It was a symbol of his struggles and defiance. For him, smoking wasn't just about breaking the rules. It was a way of showing who he was. Each puff told the world that he lived on his own terms. His voice was powerful, but the cigarette told the real story. Johnny Cash didn't follow the rules. He made his own. And the cigarette symbolized his power. As time went on and his health began to fail, he still kept smoking. It wasn't just about nicotine. It was about the life he lived, full of hardship and survival. He had lived through so much and wasn't ready to let go of the cigarette that had been part of his journey. By the time his health started to decline, the cigarette was already part of his legend. His smoking, like his music, told his story. It reminded everyone that rock and roll wasn't just about music. It was about living life fully, no matter the cost. For Cash, the cost was high, but his cigarette remained, burning through it all. 19. Lemmy Kilmister. The heart and soul of Motorhead, Lemmy Kilmister wasn't just known for his music, but for his love of smoking. If Johnny Cash was the voice of rebellion, Lemmy was the living symbol of rock and roll excess. His voice was rough and raw, and his image matched it, wild, untamed, and loud. But smoking wasn't just a habit for him. Wherever he went, on stage or off, a cigarette was always in his hand. It became a symbol of the chaos and freedom that rock and roll represented. Motorhead's music was loud and aggressive, just like Lemmy. His love for smoking was as well known as his heavy drinking and hard music. Every puff from his cigarette seemed to say, "I'm not slowing down. I'm living my life the way I want to." Even as he grew older and his health started to decline, his cigarettes stayed with him. His lifestyle had taken its toll, but he wasn't going to change. Smoking became part of his legacy. It wasn't just about nicotine. It was about living on his terms, no matter what. Lemmy's refusal to change, even when his body started to give out, made him a true rock star. He didn't care about the rules. When he passed away in 2015, it didn't erase his legacy. If anything, it made him a permanent figure in rock history. He lived by the motto, never apologize, never conform. His cigarettes were proof of that. Even after his death, his image, with a cigarette in hand, will never be forgotten. 20. George Harrison. Often called the Quiet Beatle, George Harrison was known for his thoughtful personality, spiritual journey, and his smoking. He was different from the other Beatles. While he embraced spirituality and followed Indian philosophy, he still had a rebellious side. His cigarette wasn't just a habit. It was part of who he was. Harrison wasn't as loud or flashy as some rock stars, but he still had that rock and roll spirit. Whether he was writing songs for the Beatles or working on his solo music, you could always picture him with a cigarette in hand. Smoking wasn't a contradiction for him. It was part of his personality. He was the peaceful Beatle, but he also embraced the bold, defiant side of being a rock star. The cigarette stayed with him through all parts of his career, from the calm moments of his solo work to the crazy days of Beatlemania. As he got older, Harrison eventually quit smoking. But even when he stopped, the image of him with a cigarette in hand stayed in people's minds. His cigarettes became part of his legacy, along with his music. Whether playing guitar or sitting quietly in thought, the image of him smoking remains one of the most memorable in rock history. Even though he stopped smoking, his spirit and his music. 21. Ringo Starr. The drummer of the Beatles, Ringo Starr, wasn't as loud or rebellious as the other band members, but he had his own habit: smoking. Cigarettes were always with him during the chaos of Beatlemania. While John, Paul, and George were in the spotlight, Ringo was the laid-back, cool guy, relaxed, and always with a cigarette in hand. It wasn't just that he smoked, it was part of who he was. With his smile and calm attitude, the cigarette was never far from his lips. Whether on stage, backstage, or just going about his day, it fit perfectly with his easygoing personality. Smoking became an important part of his rock and roll image. In the rock world of the 60s, smoking was common. It helped musicians deal with stress and constant attention. For Ringo, smoking helped him stay grounded in his crazy life. His cigarettes weren't just a habit, they were part of the Beatles' energy. Whether in interviews, on stage, or in photos, he was often seen with a cigarette. This became part of his legacy: the drummer with the cigarette and a smile. Even though he stopped smoking later in life, his image as a smoker stayed with him. He was remembered as the chain-smoking drummer with a relaxed attitude. Smoking became a big part of his story. 22. Ronnie Wood. The guitar player for the Rolling Stones, Ronnie Wood, is famous for his wild rock and roll lifestyle. But his smoking wasn't just a habit, it was part of his rebellious nature. On stage, he was full of energy, and his cigarette was always there. Whether it dangled from his lips while he played or hung between his fingers as he rocked out, it was part of his style. For Ronnie, smoking wasn't just something he did, it was a way of showing he didn't care about the rules. The smoke around him made him seem even more untouchable. Every time he took a drag, his energy grew. Just like the Rolling Stones were rock legends, he became just as famous for smoking, a habit he kept for many years. Even as people learned how dangerous smoking is, he kept smoking. It was hard to picture him without a cigarette. For Ronnie, smoking was about freedom and rebellion, the thing that kept the rock and roll spirit alive. It wasn't just a habit, it was a big part of who he was. 23. Roger Daltrey. The lead singer of The Who, Roger Daltrey, was known for his powerful voice. On stage, he was full of energy, singing with a roar that filled the room. But off stage, he had a quieter side, which showed in the way he smoked. A cigarette was always in his hand when he performed, a part of his rock and roll image. The smoke would rise from his cigarette as he sang some of the most famous songs in rock history. For Daltrey, smoking was more than just a habit, it was part of his rock and roll look. It symbolized the wild, rebellious spirit of The Who. When he sang songs like My Generation or Baba O'Reilly, the cigarette was always there. It was as much a part of the performance as the loud guitars and fast drums. It was a symbol of youth and rebellion, something that defined the 60s and 70s. But over time, smoking took a toll on his health. Like many rock stars, he had lived a fast life. It was part of that life, but as he got older, he knew it was time to change. He gave up smoking and started living healthier. Even so, the image of Daltrey with a cigarette still lives on in the minds of fans. That image of the untamed spirit of rock became a permanent part of The Who's history. For Daltrey and many other rock stars, smoking wasn't just about addiction. It was a part of their lifestyle. 24. Pete Townshend. The guitarist of The Who, Pete Townshend, played music as wild as his smoking. He didn't just play the guitar, he became one with it. Every time he smashed a guitar or played a fast, hard riff, he was showing his anger and frustration. His cigarette was always there, smoke rising as he played. For Townshend, smoking was more than just a habit. It was part of the chaos that followed him on stage, a symbol of his refusal to follow the rules. It reflected his frustration with the world and his desire to live life on his own terms. Every puff of smoke was a statement, reinforcing his image as a wild rock star, full of energy and rebellion, just as famous as his music. But eventually, Townshend made a big change. He quit smoking. His decision surprised many people, but even after he stopped, the image of the smoking rock star was already part of his legacy. He was forever remembered as a part of rock's raw, rebellious energy. His decision to give up smoking marked a turning point, but his time as a smoker remains an important part of his history in rock and roll. Even without a cigarette in hand, Townshend's energy and defiant spirit never faded. 25. Eddie Van Halen. More than just a guitar player, Eddie Van Halen changed the way people thought about the guitar. His solos were fast, wild, and unforgettable. But one thing that stayed the same through it all was his cigarette. He didn't just play guitar, he played with a cigarette in his hand or hanging from his lips. It was as much a part of him as his guitar skills. He could play some of the hardest, fastest guitar solos ever with a cigarette hanging from his mouth. It became part of his rock star image. While other musicians had their own habits or vices, Eddie's cigarette was always with him. It wasn't just about the music, it was about his attitude, his way of living. His guitar talent was incredible, but that cigarette was just as important to his persona. Over time, though, smoking took its toll. Like many others, he began to struggle with the health effects. Even as warnings about the dangers of smoking grew louder, the image of Eddie with a cigarette stuck. To his fans, he and his cigarette were always linked, part of the same legend. As the years went by, many rock stars held on to their cigarettes as a symbol of their rebellious rock and roll lifestyle. The smoke that filled the air wasn't just from burning tobacco. It was a symbol of everything they believed in. Even though smoking has faded for many, the image of rock stars smoking still lives on, tied forever to the music they created.